Steve Duckett, the County Extension Director here in Buncombe County, and myself, Allison Arnold, Consumer Horticulture Agent in Buncombe. I want to welcome everyone to our third in a series, Understanding Climate Change in the North Carolina Mountains. Tonight's session, Local Climate Change and How Citizens Can Make an Impact. Our speaker today is Rebecca Ward. Rebecca is the Assistant State Climatologist with the North Carolina State Climate Office. Rebecca spoke to us last week on climate change and how it works and the impact we expect to have in our mountain region. We want to welcome her back again and thank her for stepping in tonight for Kathy Dello, the Director of the State Climate Office in North Carolina, who is not able to make tonight's program. Rebecca will guide us through a discussion of actions that citizens can take to help mitigate and adapt to climate change in our community. I'm going to hand it over to you, Rebecca. Thank you.
Thanks, Allison and Steve, for letting me come back this week. Unfortunately, Kathy couldn't make it. She will be recording something though and sending it along, and she is a really great speaker, so keep an eye out for that. For those of you who weren't here last week, I wanted to just introduce myself again. If you ever see a presentation from me, I always insert an obligatory picture of me kayaking. So this was actually last weekend in Jefferson, North Carolina. It was my first trip there, and I had a blast, and we got to go kayaking down the river. I don't remember the name of the river. I should have looked it up. But I'm a North Carolina native. I grew up in Eastern North Carolina in Newport, which is in Carteret County. And in 2007, I came to NC State to study meteorology. I was always kind of a science geek. And then somewhere along the way between getting my bachelor's degree and getting my master's, I realized that I really had this passion for climate, and specifically connecting climate to people, to decisions. I work a lot with agriculture. And so that's sort of the path that I've been on. So, and that really fits really well with the work that we do at the State Climate Office of North Carolina. This is a university center. So we're actually located at NC State University. We do serve the whole state of North Carolina though. We have a staff of about 8. We're trying to grow though. We're expecting to hire a few more folks. And we have 3 core areas that we focus on. So we do applied climate research for North Carolina. So for example, understanding how our precipitation falls during the year and how that might be changing. We do extension and education. So kind of like what I'm doing tonight, giving talks, also just meeting with lots of folks, learning about their climate questions, their climate needs, and using that really to bring it back and inform the types of research that we do. And then we do monitoring. So we maintain a network of 43 weather stations across the state where we're measuring a whole host of atmospheric observations every single minute of every single day. And all of that information is available online for free to anyone. So that's just a bit about me and about my office. And so now I wanted to jump into tonight's talk. And I really only have a few slides, but before jumping into those, I wanted to just hear from you a little bit, if you would type into the chat. So I was just curious if you're willing to enter into the Zoom chat here. What's interesting to you about climate change actions, or what's brought you here tonight to hear about climate change actions in North Carolina? Yeah, so I see a question is, can my small actions make a difference? I want to know, what can I do to make a difference? How can the average person work locally to mitigate climate impacts? What can I do to mitigate climate change? Someone says I'm going to a plant-based diet. I want to know pragmatic actions gardeners should take from now forward. The dramatic weather across the country, it very much has been dramatic lately. Just look at the sky today, right? Smoke from the west, very scary. What's going to happen with pests? Just generally concerned about climate change, wanting to know about how it's affecting forests, wanting to reduce my carbon footprint. How can we navigate and assist us in navigating climate change in the future? Great. Thank you for sharing those reasons for being here tonight. A lot of them actually really resonate very closely with my own personal reasons and why I care about this topic. And Susan just entered, there's so much discouraging about climate change. What can we tell people in ways that they can help? There's a lot it's right. It's not a bright and sunny and happy topic, but I'm hoping that tonight's discussion gives you some tools to feel like you can do something. So I'm gonna step forward to my next slide here and just kind of big picture, take a step back and think about what are the types of, when we're saying actions that we can take, how do these fall along, a spectrum? So there's a couple ways I think about it. So there's across the top two boxes here, and one I have adaptation and the other I have mitigation. So these are kind of, not opposites. A lot of times they're very complementary to each other, but adaptation is really kind of like risk management. So it's saying, what are actions that we can take at the individual level, at local, regional, even global levels to reduce our risks from today's changed climate to climate impacts that we're going to experience in the future. And then we have mitigation, which isn't saying how can we sort of protect ourselves, take action against risk. This is actually saying how can we actually address the problem of climate change? How can we limit or stop emissions or even pull those greenhouse gases out of the atmosphere? So those are sort of two ends, and I'll go more into detail on them. And on the bottom two rows, I put individual and then collective. So there's things that we can each do individually as actions. And that's really what I'm going to focus on tonight. But it will, everything that I mentioned will sort of touch on to other things that are happening at sort of a larger scale. So that's where we have collective action. So there's a couple of different ways to think about this, but I usually end up thinking about it as kind of the government level. So, we think about things coming across North Carolina state government, new regulations, new incentive programs, new funding. Same at the federal level, when the new transportation bill going through, actions or things in there to fund climate change mitigation and adaptation projects. So those are sort of more of those collective actions. So on the mitigation side, I mentioned that this really is about sort of getting to the root of what's causing climate change, right? So I wanted to start here. So sort of three ways to think about it, and it's really two. I guess I sort of split the middle. This middle one sort of is a stepping from the other two. So you can take mitigation actions to stop or slow emissions down. You can take mitigation actions with the intent to store carbon or other greenhouse gases. So maybe you're not stopping emitting, but you're sort of preventing them from getting into the atmosphere. And then there are mitigation actions to actually take carbon out of the atmosphere and store it somewhere. So a lot of times if you hear things about geoengineering, that's usually where that enters the conversation, is kind of more of these, how do we try to someday remove it from the atmosphere we've put there. So just kind of some, again, high level examples of what this might look like. So on the sort of stop or slow side, a lot of, and this has really been in the news a lot lately, is looking at how we generate our power. So how can we switch our energy generation from fossil fuels like coal or natural gas and move on to renewables like wind or solar, nuclear, biofuels. So doing this, if we can replace parts of our grid where the energy generation is coming from these renewable sources, then that will stop or slow our emissions. On the sort of save, store them side, a lot of examples are around changing or just being a little bit more deliberate in how we manage the land. So doing things like planting more forests or saving forests to store that carbon in the trees and in the soil. And then lastly, the geoengineering is things like how can we create new engineering solutions, technological advancements where we can take CO2 out of the atmosphere through chemical processes, store them into geologic reservoirs, so in these big underground rock formations, or use them, turn them into some product that we use, like polymers or cements. So in North Carolina, in terms of mitigation, there's actually a lot of work happening. And this really comes out of Governor Cooper's Executive Order 80, North Carolina's commitment to address climate change and a transition to a clean energy future, and that URL is at the bottom. And there's a couple of goals that this set up. You know, the big one is to just generally overall, let's reduce our greenhouse gas emissions in the state by 40% below those 2005 levels. And then this graph on the right side, I pulled from, it's like one of the things that you can click on from that URL at the bottom, and it'll show you just from 2017 where all of the state's emissions came from. It's a greenhouse gas inventory. So a couple of goals that the state has in terms of mitigation, right? So to stop emissions is to actually have a carbon neutral power sector by 2050. And so there's a lot of things that the state's looking at in terms of how do we change our regulatory model to make it so that we can introduce more of these solar things. Oh, and thank you for dropping that link in the chat there. Another way is that the state is trying to incentivize having more electric vehicles. So the goal is to have 80,000 zero emission vehicles by 2025 in North Carolina. And I was looking at the chart on their website today, and it looks like they have about 30,000 as of June of this year. So it has been increasing. So they're going up. Cities and towns in the state have been doing roundtables, working on ways to reduce their own greenhouse gas emissions at a more local level. And that's being led by a nonprofit group, the Environmental Defense Fund. And then finally, the state is looking at carbon storage through natural working lands. So like I had mentioned on the last slide, looking at conserving forested lands through easements or acquisitions, doing things like encouraging agricultural conservation, practices that, reducing tillage, which might encourage decomposition and put more carbon into the atmosphere, doing more no-till, which keeps it in the soil, and doing things like reducing food waste. Anything we can do to limit how much we grow and then have to transport food if we don't have to do that multiple times by wasting food, that will also lower the state's carbon footprint. So just some examples of the mitigation actions. And again, I'm here, I guess these examples are a little bit more from that collective side, not quite the individual. So on the adaptation side, as I mentioned earlier, right, it's a form of risk management. And when we're talking about climate change, risk often comes from a combination of exposure to climate hazards. So, for example, where I live in Apex, North Carolina, my house is actually in a floodplain. So that's a climate hazard that I live with. So it's a combination of that, a combination of your sensitivity to those hazards. So, my house has a crawl space, we're a little bit elevated, so that lowers my sensitivity somewhat. And then your adaptive capacity. So basically, can I actually do things to protect myself and my property? So, right, for me and my house in the floodplain, I have flood insurance, and I've also taken steps to plant lots of vegetation around the creek bed to try to slow and soak up some of that water when it does rain. A lot of the actions that people can take that are adaptive, they tend to be really beneficial overall. So for example, kind of a larger scale run rate is if you were to restore wetland areas to reduce flood risk. So planting more marsh grasses or other types of native vegetation, that with the intent of just reducing the sort of speed of water that comes through or helping it soak in, that will help protect properties from flooding, but it will also do things like improve the ecosystem health. It creates habitat for native animal species. So generally they have really great benefits overall. So generally on the right side of this, I put the steps to adaptation. And this is still thinking from kind of that bigger kind of community or even like larger scale government lens. The first step is generally to become aware of the issue, right? So we need to do something, say, to protect against flooding or wildfires. The next step is to assess what is the actual risk, as well as like what are the options. And then there is planning. So what can we do? How can we make it happen? What are the resources we need? And then there's implementation. So actually doing whatever action it is that will be an adaptation action. And then finally monitoring and evaluation. So did it work? Do we need to make any adjustments? This process it's ongoing. it's repetitive, and across, there's really no one size fits all, and that's at any scale from one person's house to the next person's house. That same solution may not work in both situations. And another challenge with adaptation is that, it really is thinking about risks, today, but also far into the future. And so getting access to the type of information about what our climate is going to look like, what are the risks that we're going to face in 20 years, in 40 or 50 or 80 years, having that information really needs to be built into the planning for whatever you end up implementing. And so that's just a big thing that is really, I'm seeing come into play a lot now, is government agencies thinking about how can we get the right information we need to make sure that if we're building something, that it's going to actually help us for the risks that we're expecting in the future, not just what we experienced in the past. So it's kind of my overview of mitigation adaptation. So I'm just going to list out on the next couple of slides some of the examples, types of examples. This isn't meant to be an exhaustive list. This is also not meant to be a prescriptive, you should do this list. My intent is just to kind of show the range of types of things that we can do that are individual. And I do want to say that most of these I actually pulled out of Asheville's Climate Resilience Guide, and I put the link on these slides so you can access it. There's also a couple of other resources I have links to at the end of these slides. They're really great because it's sort of here's your risk that we're experiencing here. Here are the types of actions you can do, and it gives you a price range for them. And it kind of tells you too, maybe what are some other things that you should be thinking about. So I highly recommend it. It's from Asheville, but I think it's applicable, even where I am. They have a section on landslides, which maybe isn't as relevant for where I live, but other things in it really are. So one of the things that's a really small action is to do something like an energy audit. So looking and seeing what places in your house, where do you have, windows or doors that aren't sealed well, where you could be having, air coming in from the outside, or, your nice cooled air or heated air inside that's escaping outside. So doing something really simple like identifying where those areas are, caulking, putting some insulation in, those can all do things like, increase your resilience to just being impacted by air temperatures outside, especially during something like a heat wave or really strong cold spell. But they ultimately also reduce your energy needs, right? Because you don't have to spend as much energy to warm or cool that space. That also lowers your emissions. Things like rain barrels, when we do get into a dry spell or a drought, anything you can do to sort of, not use potable water that's been, pumped and treated. If you're able to have something like a rain barrel that's collected water off your roof, then that will help you be more resilient to be able to water your lawn or your garden plants, but also do things like, lower how much energy is needed to pump water out of the ground, or to pump water from, if you get like on city water or something. Other types of small actions, more on the mitigation side, not the adaptation side, are doing things like carpooling or working from home, so not driving as much. So this can reduce your emissions associated with transportation. This is assuming that you're driving a gas-powered vehicle, or if you have an electric vehicle that's powered by non-renewable energy sources. And then planting trees. So I think, there's maybe planting one tree, right? It's probably not going to solve climate change, right? But every single tree helps. And a single tree in your yard or in a downtown block that stores carbon in the tree itself, but it also provides shade to buildings, shade to ground, and it provides habitat for insects and things like squirrels. So it's a net positive to do something like that. Some examples of actions, these are, I kind of labeled these sort of like medium to large, and I was thinking in terms of, disruption or cost to your life. So the first one on the upper left here is to relocate, elevate, or flood proof. So this is thinking about if you say live in a floodplain, or you in the future might be at risk for flooding. So buildings that are in flood prone areas are the most vulnerable from flooding. And so doing things to either elevate that whole building if it's at a risk, or at least elevating the things inside of it so that they don't get ruined. especially electronics or like an HVAC system. You can also flood proof if you have a basement to just sort of create some barrier between floodwaters on the outside and the interior of your home. On the upper right is installing HVAC. So this is thinking about extreme heat, and this is an adaptation measure. So when there is a really big heat wave, or even just, it gets hot in the summer, even in the mountains, right? And so if you don't have some sort of air conditioning system, installing one can really help your resiliency to an extreme heat wave. And there are other things that you can do that are also lower cost. So, planting a tree, making use of shade, so keeping blinds closed or putting awnings on a building, all of those will help keep things a little bit cooler. Putting a ceiling fan in a room too will help. Solar panels, this is a mitigation. Installing solar panels is a way to offset, looking at the net grid, how much of that power generation is coming from solar renewable energy versus non-renewable energy sources. And then another adaptation is thinking about wildfires, which are definitely something of concern in the mountains of North Carolina. North Carolina is actually #1 in the nation for residential areas in the wildland urban interface, which basically just means we have a lot of homes that are really close to wooded areas. And so that just increases our risk as a state to wildfire damage. So doing things around your house, if you live in a place like this, is to just make sure that you've done things like keeping leaves and pine needles and whatnot out of your gutters, keeping mulch away from the house, anything flammable basically away from the house, trimming trees, making sure that no canopy is over the house, since a lot of house fires from wildfires begin with embers that have spread over. So those are, right, I want to spend a lot of time on discussion. So these are just kind of those across those 4 dimensions. I wanted to add 2 other types of actions, just to say that they're also important, but I saw these as less like tangible things to do. So one is just generally, and I said civil engagement, it's just civic engagement. I'll make that fix before I share these slides. So, voting, becoming involved in community projects and planning around climate change, adaptation, mitigation, resilience, and then also social norms. So the more that we talk about climate change as a society, the more that we see things around us, the more that we see solar panels go up on people's homes, see things come from, the places where we pay our, electricity bills. If we see that they're, generating that electricity from wind energy, right? The more that it becomes a normalized thing, then the more approachable it is to actually do something about it. And the more it also encourages others to do the same. So just a couple of slides of resources. And again, I will make these slides. I'll share them so that you have access to them. On the left here is from City of Asheville, their climate resilience plan is that first link. On the bottom there is the Asheville Climate Resilience Guide that I was pulling a lot of those actions from. This is EPA's carbon footprint calculator. It's actually, I've done it a few times. It's kind of fun to go in and just kind of see how much greenhouse gas emissions can you save over the course of a week or a year by, doing X fewer miles driven, or maybe doing, if you're looking to do some sort of home renovation, this can also help you think about the carbon footprint of that. And then 2 other sources on the right there, Project Drawdown, a lot of mitigation type of actions. And then the Yale Climate Communication Group also has a list of actions there. If you'd like to stay up to date on local North Carolina specific news about climate and climate change, just 4 resources here. They're probably going to be a little bit lighter on actions, but a lot of times we'll link to things that kind of get more into actions. So those are all the slides I have. So I'm going to stop sharing. And if you have questions, you can either type them in the chat, or if you'd like to just type your name in the chat, then we'll call on you and you can unmute yourself to ask your question out loud.
This is America we built and one we explore. One that's been paved and one that's forever wild.
I'll start, Rebecca. I have a question about your understanding of what municipalities may be doing around tree ordinances, things like that, that you might be happening down in your area around Raleigh to create guidelines around tree planting and tree preservation. Just the whole urban canopy piece seems really important.
It does. And actually, so I'm making a note of this on the side here. I've not seen anything come across my desk on like guidelines for this, right? There's been so many studies, especially that have been publicized in the past year, talking about, you know, especially in urban areas where we do and we don't have trees, and how that really generally intersects with places where we have people with lower incomes or people who are not white. And so I feel like there's probably something that I don't know. So I'll make a note so I can follow up on that.
Listen to what Dr. Paul is saying, or what Dr. Carlson is saying. They may be increasing the risk of getting.
Okay, and I'm seeing some questions coming at the chat. So somebody said, oh, please repeat the Yale climate link. Yes, that is the Yale climate communications. And I will send these slides out, so you'll have a copy of all of these.
For anyone who's not joined us before, we are making a recording of this and we'll be sending it out to you directly.
Let's see. Nina asked, there is a little out there, but I've been looking at how to use plant transpiration to manage water in low elevation, no slope situations. Is there anything available on this? I guess I've not heard of using plant transpiration. I don't know. I guess I don't know a lot about plants. I don't know if Allison, you have anything you can.
I don't really have anything to add at the moment.
But I will say, so using plants to manage the landscape, especially like if you're talking about like a place that gets poor drainage, that's generally good. Anything we can use to pull that water up through plants versus just letting it sit there or run off is better. Making note of this too. Plant transpiration. Let's see, and then Ron asked, some municipalities restrict the installation of solar panels either by size or by location. Can this be overcome? So I would recommend that you talk to your municipality and see what their rules are. I know, so like, so I'm looking at getting solar panels on my own house. So we've looked at this, like, can our HOA limit things like that? And I know that there are rules for things like you can install, a satellite dish on your house. And so like there's things that protect what you can put on your own house. And so I would just see if solar panels falls underneath that. And I would hope it can be overcome. And Ron, I saw you raise your hand there.
Yeah, can you hear me?
Yes.
Okay, I live on the edge of Flat Rock, and they have a rule that you can't have solar panels on your roof if you can see them from the street. And I know of one case where a house is on the corner. So it actually says the facade is the front of a house. But since the house is on a corner, they said, well, the facade is both sides that face the street.
Gotcha.
This doesn't affect me personally. Actually, I have solar panels, but it affected one of my neighbors.
That's interesting. I've never heard of that, but I'm glad you brought it up. And that's where, the getting involved, if you don't like the rules, right, get involved and become the one who makes the rules is always possible. Yeah.
Yeah, well, yeah, actually, I've talked to some people who are thinking of trying to get out of Flat Rock, so.
Let's see, Hope and Larry asked, I read recently that composting versus putting compost appropriate in the garbage for pickup can help. Yeah, so composting is a great way to sort of recycle the waste coming out of your kitchen versus sending that somewhere else. Yeah. I don't actually know the numbers for, like, some places do a compost, like a community compost pickup kind of deal the same way you do your recycling and your trash. I don't know sort of the equivalence there. if it's like a really great, and efficient process or not in terms of greenhouse gases.
I just put a link in for the Composting Council. They have a whole page on climate change initiatives through their work. So.
I also just dropped a link in the chat for the Solarize campaign for Buncombe County. So if you live in Buncombe County, they're doing bulk kind of purchasing of solar panels. And so the more people that buy solar panels, the lower the price goes. And it doesn't have to do with when you buy, it has to do with the end of the campaign. Whatever the price is at the end of the campaign is what everyone gets. So I put a link in there if you'd like to know more about that.
That's great. Thank you.
Yes, thank you so much. It delights me to hear about things like that going on. I'm gonna just, there's a question on tree species. I'm gonna skip down to the next one since we're talking about solar panels, from John asking, are home panels really worthwhile given obsolescence and recycling issues? And should we press more for solar and solar farms where there is efficiency of scale? I will tell you, I'm gonna take off my sort of, speaking on behalf of NC State and just kind of tell you my informed from learning about solar panels, from trying to put them on my own house. It is worth it. And most panels, the ones that we're looking at, which are pretty common today for being placed in your house, don't ask me the specifics for them. That's not my area of expertise, but they'll still be very efficient 25, 30 years down the road. So for me, that's worth it. And we can offset, up to 80% to 100% of our current energy usage, which to me is worth it. And so the way I think about it isn't, I think I try to think about it as like the grid as a whole, the electricity that goes into the grid that gets used by everyone. If we can just put more things that supply energy to the grid that are coming from things like home solar, that's great, right? And especially if you have a house with a roof that's just sitting there, I feel like it's like, let's use that for something, right? Which is what my, I don't have a shaded house. It gets really great southern sun exposure. So it seemed like an easy decision for my husband and I to make. And I'll add, so on terms of efficiency of scale, yeah, so putting in a really great, big solar farm, sure, that will generate a lot more electricity and scale. But I think that it's going to take all of it to make it really happen. And Ladorna said, solar panels, wait until you need and put up a new roof before you put in solar panels. So I would agree with that. There are systems, the way they install them, they can take it off if you need to install a new roof and then put it on. But yes, it is less of a headache if you can put a new roof on first. Coming back up to the question from Nina about what about metrics for the carbon storage capacity of various tree species? That's a really great question. I'm writing this down. My educated guess, maybe not so educated, is that faster growing species are probably going to store more of it just because they're going to grow more quickly. But I will try to follow up on that, unless anybody here knows the answer to that. Oh, and then there was another question about anaerobic versus aerobic production of bacteria with composting. I am not sure which is better for the atmosphere, honestly. Or which is better for composting, honestly, I don't know. Yeah.
Well, for aerobic is for composting, yeah, but I don't know in regards to the atmosphere. I'm not into that level yet. And I've not really seen anything, not that I've done a lot of research on specific tree species that are better. I mean, I tend to agree with you. Faster growing material. I know diversity is super important, especially when it comes into woodland forests. So,
yeah. And I'm thinking more on the anaerobic versus aerobic. So this is if you'll bear with me as I like reason through this. So a lot of like in eastern North Carolina, and I think even parts of the mountains where we have like bogs, we have peat soils in the eastern part of the state for sure, right? And that is just anaerobic processes where we have materials, so they haven't really decomposed, that carbon is all still there. So I it might, maybe it's that the anaerobic is you're essentially creating peat soils and you're not decomposing, so that carbon and anything else is not going into the atmosphere. In terms of methane, I don't know if it releases more methane if the process is working, but if so like permafrost, I guess maybe is a good analogy, that the frozen soils of the north that used to be always frozen, so kind of similarly all that organic matter was kind of locked in a frozen state. Now that the earth is warming to the point that the ground gets above freezing there, now it's decomposing and releasing lots of methane. So I think it's I don't think that it being an anaerobic process itself generates more methane. I think it's just if you introduce oxygen and allow that decomposition to happen, it creates methane. Let's see. And then Jane said, I have read that allowing native species to thrive in disturbed areas absorbs more carbon than planting city trees. I think, yeah, that kind of gets to Allison's point, yeah. Yeah, so there's a lot of questions on, how to know which, like can you put in solar panels or not? And I'll see if I can find like a central resource that might point you to that. I feel like there might be something with like the Department of Energy, but I'll check that out. And I will say too, it's been really interesting to learn about how the grid works, and I will say, like everyone's decision and what they're able to do, it's all very, very personal, and what you can afford and what your situation allows, right? I think we've lucked out where I live that we get net metering, and so for me that was really what I was wanting, just in the sense of I wanted to make sure that whatever we did got put into the grid and was always connected to the grid, because I didn't care if the electricity that I'm using to power my computer right now, if that came from the panels on my house. I just cared that it was used for somebody's electricity. So, and then Sue brings up a good point about minimizing lawn areas, which should be helpful for reducing energy use for mowing and increasing diversity of plants for animals and insects. Yeah, I like that, because that's one of those examples of things that has multiple benefits that outweigh the costs, right? So you can, I think it's, it could be more aesthetically pleasing to have, native plants and flowering plants versus a lawn. But it's also less work to maintain, and you attract things like insects and birds to your area as well. So can I ask, since keep the questions coming in, but I always like to kind of pull my audience. Is there something that's really resonating with you tonight? I didn't come in and want to give you a list of 30 things that you could do, but I wanted to at least sort of open the door to the types of things you can do, and to hopefully convey that they do actually have a measurable impact. Is anyone willing to share, what's resonating with you tonight? Are you fired up to go do something? Are you just as unhappy about this as ever? Yeah.
So Rebecca, I'll start off with that one. I think the idea of civic engagement, and as one person put it, civic engagement, is a really good concept. We can model some practices. We can engage with our communities, with our homeowners associations in a positive way. And a lot of people do have a mindset that a nicely manicured lawn is what a home should look like, and maybe ways that we could say, well, you've got flowers that attract pollinators, and kind of start with a thin edge of the wedge maybe, but there are small steps we can take in our own space that can make things better.
And I would just add to that, Rebecca, I think people have touched on it, municipalities, but specifically HOAs, I think are challenging, because they have set guidelines about managing landscapes.
Mhm.
And that's actually, you know, it seems like a really good opportunity to get neighbors to work together. You know, we know that firescaping, for instance, is very effective community-wide, and also lawn management, but it requires an aesthetic adjustment, you know, for
Mhm.
everybody to be able to adapt to having pollinators in their lawn and not just a monoculture. So it's the long game for sure, but I think it's very doable. And for people to really, you know, speak up and care and do it in a constructive way. There are a lot of resources to help people do that. So
Yeah, and I think that that's you know, doing something that's visible is always, you know, a great way to sort of inspire that, oh, look, they have solar panels, maybe we could do that too, kind of mentality. But just being a voice there who just kind of brings this up and says, hey, what about this? Have you thought about this? Can we do this? I think that that is what we really need, because the less of a sort of rare topic this is, right? The more things actually happen around it.
yeah.
I also think that in terms of native plants and how the role that trees and plants have to play in our landscape, and I think part of it is there's great ignorance about what that means. In a more developed neighborhood where HOAs are often, what they've come to think of native plants as being is no lawn care. Weeds grow. And the thing I think many people completely miss is that good landscaping is good landscaping. It really is, just period. Good landscaping is beautiful, whatever it is. And in North Carolina, particularly in the Western Mountains, we are so blessed with many of the things you'd go buy at a nursery are native and will come all by their little lonesomes. And, you know, I think setting up gardens and areas in your yard, and because butterflies are pretty rare in some of those developed neighborhoods. And if you get some good native pollinator friendly species going, people start noticing. We have a lot of people go, why is it you're the only yard in the neighborhood with butterflies? And it's twofold. One of it's plants, and the other is we don't poison the crud out of everything. But I think walking the talk, people saying you walk to the grocery store if you can, or walk wherever you go, or combining trips, and complaining about combining trips, but doing it because it's the right thing is fine too. We're 45 minutes from a grocery store, so it's combining trips. But I think a lot of it is that it's become such a hostile. I'm the person with the civic engagement. The people could just make it a way of life. You know, this is just what we do together. It's not something we argue about. It's just something we do.
Yeah. I think that you put that very, very, very eloquently.
Absolutely. Rebecca, there's a question in the chat box about your opinion of drawdown.
Yeah, so I will say I have sort of skimmed drawdown, and I've been generally like, this seems pretty reasonable, and I think it's a good resource.
Could you explain what it is?
Yeah, so it's and I'll drop the link in the chat here so we can. It's basically here are solutions to climate change that you can implement. And the idea, as I understand it, was to both do like things that you can do as an individual, as well as kind of that blueprint for like larger, like a municipality or a larger governmental organization, you know, to try to say, here's basically to remove that barrier of, I don't know what to do, to say, well, here's the listing of all the things that you can do. My impression has been that it's pretty well researched and that it's pretty thorough. So I would highly recommend, you know, if you're curious and you want to learn more, because there's things in there that I hadn't thought about before. So it was nice to see that list. And so I think it's just a great way to generate some ideas. So my only caveat is I haven't read it thoroughly, so I can't say, you know, is this the perfect resource or the best, but I have found it to generally be a good resource.
Okay, great, thank you.
Any other things resonating with folks or other questions or, you know, if you have something that you have done or are considering doing and you want to share it with the group, that I welcome you to do that as well. Let's see, I got a question about the Green New Deal. It seems challenging for politicians to embrace it publicly and get elected. Yeah, so I will admit to not following too closely when new deals like that get proposed, because I know that they're always going to get modified and adjusted, and you know, reconciliation, you know, that the initial idea is never going to be what happens. I will say that I can walk my line very carefully here. I think that it's encouraging to see politicians, you know, and lawmakers, right, you know, come out and say, this is something we care about and we need to do real action on it, because I think that that's a really great place to be thinking. And I'm encouraged by that. Yeah, and yeah, so Ladorna mentioned, you know, that the drawdown website is continually updated. Yeah, I think it is as well. And I haven't read the book. I've only looked at the website, and it does seem to get updated pretty regularly. And then Shirley mentioned that we have the new dark solar panels. Congratulations on having solar panels that blend in better with the roof. They don't have the reflective silver on them, but they're a little bit more expensive. And that I think brings up a good point too, right? It's like, you know, there's a lot more like federal investments happening now into solar and wind energy. And I think that as that happens, right, that encourages innovation, which and with electric cars too, right? There's lots of pushes now to change over our just, you know, US fleet of vehicles, right, that we all have. And so as we see these big transitions happen, we're going to see lots of innovations, and that should pull the price down and make things more affordable. And also, as they become more affordable, they become more visible. I've seen a lot more, well, I mean, I live in the Research Triangle Park in Raleigh, so I've seen a lot more Teslas driving around the area this year, since I wasn't really on the roads at all last year. So it's been kind of a, wow, that's a lot. So.
Okay. So Rebecca, anything else you want to say in closing?
Yeah, thank you for the conversation tonight. You know, and if you think of a question or you find a resource, please reach out. You know, I may not have an answer for you, but I'll try to connect you with somebody who does.
That's really great. I appreciate bringing our attention to the actual resilience plan that's in their guide, and that's a great place to start. I'm always interested, many of our common good gardening practices are very supportive of what we're talking about tonight. And so hopefully together going forward, we can all work and accepting some adaptations and mitigations as well. So I do want to remind people that the second session that Rebecca did last week talked a good bit about the impacts that we will be expecting here and already experiencing some in our area, and just being aware and being observant of how the rain falls, for instance, on your property, and when it falls hard and when it falls fast and in great quantities, and where it moves, and mitigating and adapting to that is very important. So our gardening observations are going to be really key moving forward. What plants work well, what plants are struggling by the high impact of rain, and of course then droughts that we may experience that we have in the past. We are good at getting our hands in the dirt and watching the environment, the plants around us. If no one has anything else to say tonight or ask Rebecca any questions, thank you, Rebecca, so much for joining us, and thank you everyone for joining us. I hope everyone has a great evening. Thank you.